All right. Again, thank you for the invitation, WSU Global, and that nice introduction as well. So in a workshop situation, a panel like this, I like to know who I'm speaking to. So let me ask you some questions, and if you could raise your hand while you're eating a submarine sandwich, that'd be great. So how many of you are in the early first couple of years of your teaching career? Okay, a couple of those, great. How many of you have never taught a college level class before? None of those, all right? How many of you have taught for, let's not put numbers on, many years? Okay, all right, a number of you have taught. And how many of you are interested and receptive into learning something new about teaching? Okay, thank you, all right. So we'll move on. Here's where we're going in my segment today. I want to give you a little background about the course I teach and sort of set up the problem. I want to discuss some really good accessible approaches to solving my problem. We're going to actually practice and have some discussion that may be a little challenging to capture for those people we're streaming to. I'll summarize and leave some time for your questions, okay? So this is very casual and interactive, and I hope you'll interrupt me at any time. My students choose to do that, and I encourage and empower you to do the same. All right, so I teach a microbiology course. I am a classically trained scientist who came to WSU a while back. Again, we won't talk about years really, but and I'm a classically trained scientist who was never trained in education and therefore asked to teach a class in my first week of employment at WSU. So I was uniquely unprepared for that task, but I did model my teaching on some people who I thought had done it well, but I was in the wilderness. Now again, if you're in the College of Education, maybe you're actively trained in that manner. I was not that person. So I was trained in test tubes. This particular class is a pre-nursing prerequisite. That's the bulk of our students, but there are a lot of other students who are non-science majors who are using the class to get their wet lab UCOR requirement. So there are all sorts of courses on campus that satisfy certain requirements, but the population of this particular online class is somewhat diverse. And the online class parallels a class which is offered during the year, but the class that's offered during the year has a unique component. It has a weekly laboratory. So students are hearing lecture, they're doing some work on their own, and they're going to the laboratory, putting on a lab coat, and doing the test tube work. And they have that sort of reinforcement of the concepts. The problem is that in the online environment, we can't really ask students to do the same kinds of experiments that are employing some biosafety techniques we have here on campus. So I converted this class in 2008 and used an inquiry basis using some non-toxic approaches. So for example, as depicted here, when I want to teach students about yeast metabolism and fermentation of sugars that leads to carbon dioxide, I actually have them bake bread at home, okay? Fairly non-toxic. There are some exceptions, but we won't talk about that. A lot of my students have never baked bread. A lot of my students are professional bread bakers. That was harder to say than I thought. But the reality is that it's a really tactile example of the kind of conversion, and I'm meeting a learning objective, but I'm doing it in a novel way. I'm not going to focus so much on that, but I want to encourage you to think about new ways to reach your student learning outcomes. So my challenge initially was that using this format in the online environment where I didn't see students in the laboratory every day, they had to turn in some written homework in the form of reports and essays, short essays, and students doing this sort of work would routinely turn in things that indicated, A, they had trouble navigating the learning management system. I got a lot of questions about where do I find that? How do I press the button? How do I see my grade? They had trouble with basic English. And many of you who teach entering WSU students knows that there's a complete array or a large spectrum of competencies for the students we're admitting right now. And that's a huge challenge across disciplines. In addition, what I found is there was very great difficulty with sifting through what Google handed you when you typed in microbiology, yeast, and bread baking. okay? And students had trouble discerning credible sources from everything that search engines handled them, all right? Do any of your students have this problem? Right. Many of them, if you ask them, identify themselves as highly critical. They're good critical thinking. I know bad internet sources when I see them. So what I did was have an experience kind of like this. My expectations for the assignments were that I'd made my expectations clear. They were going to hand in great lab reports. They were going to use credible sources that they thought they knew how to find. The reality was very, very different, okay? All right, the reality was that students were turning in all sorts of things. So what I did, and this was facilitated by a National Science Foundation fellowship called Biology Scholars that I was involved in. Your area of discipline may have a similar sort of thing, but it was professional development for me that got me some training specifically in science education, with the emphasis on education or the science thereof. All right, so I evaluated a number of options, a number of ways to go, and what I decided to do was put a first assignment in that I call a warm-up or success activity. All right, it doesn't have essay in the name. It's really focused on helping orient students to the course. It clarifies my expectations. It allows students to do things. It gets them to navigate the learning management system whether they want to or not, and it gives them immediate feedback about whether they're meeting the expectations that I'm going to use throughout the course every week of the 15-week semester. And this sort of bullets here are really, really useful in letting students know the lay of the land from the get-go, right out of the box. So here is the assignment, okay? And I won't read that a lot. Well, maybe I will for those who are streaming. So I want you to write a short essay about the definition, your definition and criteria of a credible source. Should be at least 250 words. It should discuss your criteria clearly. It might include difficult parts of it, gray areas, things you have trouble with. And I add some things that are course policies just to remind them. So all my assignments have to have at least 2 non-wiki, non-online text sources. And that means that your essay about sources has to have credible sources. Right? You see what I did there? Right. Okay. Yeah, it was subtle, I know. All right. I also have a lot of materials about plagiarism and how to do that. So what I'd like to do now is have you use...
Plagiarism and how to do that?
I misspoke. How to avoid plagiarism. Thank you. Thank you, Sheila. I'm glad you're listening. All right. So on your desk is an index card. And in real time, in live time, we're going to spend some time. What I'd like you to do is write down at least 2 of your personal criteria for credible sources, and be prepared to share, okay? So I'm going to give you 180 seconds, maybe less, to do that, okay? You can write down 5, but I want a minimum of 2, okay? How do you decide what's credible and what's not? And if you need a card, I see you, Rachel, you're hiding back there. I have extra cards up here if you need them. Ruth is handing those out. All right, this part of the exercise gets you to commit and share publicly 2 things I affirm in your teaching. Do you want to borrow my pen?
Are you going to call on me?
I'm going to call on you. I'm going to pick on you because that's what professors do. All right, you got about 30 more seconds. Many of you have come up with some terms. What I'd like you to do is pair and share. Turn to your neighbor and get to know them. Maybe introduce yourself very briefly and tell them your minimum of 2 criteria. Go. All right, let's reconvene very briefly here. Thank you for your engagement. Appreciate that. Anybody want to share one of their criteria? Did you and your partner come to a consensus? Have a shared criteria maybe? Anyone, do you have a good example you want to share?
We do have a common criteria, which is peer-reviewed journal publication.
Okay.
Peer-reviewed journal publications.
Great, thank you. All right, so a primary literature source from a peer-reviewed publication is one of the criteria. And there's some greater consensus around here. Ruth has that microphone. All right, great. Any other thing you'd like to add? Go ahead, into the microphone, please.
So ours was slightly expanded on that in that they're making reference to experts, but there are cases where people are experts but aren't necessarily using information in an expert way. So adding on to that the source is not showing an obvious bias. So for example, I know of at least one person who intentionally got a PhD in biology and is a creationist, and they got the PhD so that they can say, I have a PhD in biology and I'm a creationist, so
Okay.
But they still have a very strong bias in anything they're going to say about evolution.
So being aware of those biases, again, we're asking our students who are novices to sniff out a good expert versus a pseudo-expert. I don't know about that particular example, but that's very difficult. Again, it's easy for an expert to say, well, I know expertise because I've been in the field for 20 years or 20 months or something like that. But our students are novices, and these are, in many cases, students who are not science competent in my case. And so the terminology and they don't know whether that's a legitimate institution or some false institution. We could spend another hour talking about this, and maybe that's something we should do at some point. But it's amazing what students turn in, and I want to move on and give you an example. So here's an example of, this is an excerpt from an assignment I just got in the last year. And again, I won't read this to you. Those of you who are streaming could probably read it faster. But there are a couple of things going on here. The way the student writes is not employing the best practices for an essay. You know, there's not a introductory paragraph, there's not a summary paragraph, there's not a clear answer to the assignment's question, which was give me the criteria. And there are some sources down here that may or may not be credible, okay? One comes from Columbia College. That should not be confused with Columbia University, by the way. And another from a source which varies. So for example, I mentioned my bread baking assignment. I've had students cite the Cooking Light website as a credible source. And again, for microbiology information, maybe not. But students often talk about being able to discern the authorship of their source, whether it comes from a primary research literature, peer-reviewed source. But I've essentially created a circular assignment. They have to use sources to talk about sources, and I assess whether or not they apply their own criteria. And you'd be surprised how many students lay out a great criteria. They can find the online writing program from a bona fide university and cite that appropriately, and then completely violate that rule in the rest of the essay. So without focusing on this assignment, it's just an example of the great spectrum we see in our student competencies. So I'm going to move on because we've got other panelists, of course, but I want you to make sure you're explicit in your instructions to your students and repeat that explicit instruction. I want you to try and provide some transparent ways in which they can get feedback, especially early in the course. Giving students the opportunity to do rather than telling them what to do is critical. That's what I tried to model today by having you work on this assignment. And finally, I want to encourage your students to post things publicly, to share them, and respond to each other in an appropriate, professional, constructive manner in the online environment. That's possible using our learning management system. You can set up discussion forums for each assignment you want to have this happen, and it's a great way to help students hold each other accountable, even when it comes to the issues of things like information literacy. So I've been brief, I've been quick, but I wonder if you have any questions before I hand the mic to our next panelist. And again, if you would speak into the mic.
Of course.
Great. So in case streamers didn't hear that, how do I assess these assignments when students hand them in? I use a feature in the Angel learning management system, a rubric-based grading criteria, which is essentially a matrix between rows, which are areas of expertise in this assignment, and columns, which are point values from 1, 0 might be absent, 1 might be emerging, 2 might be highly developed, and 3 might indicate expertise. And so I've got a very transparent way in giving them feedback in specific areas. And for every assignment, sources is one of those rows in that rubric. And again, I could give them a numerical point value, but by showing them the rubric matrix of which area I gave you points in, that helps them dissect what they did well and areas they need to improve on. Is that helpful? Yeah. And again, if there's some great angel help if you want to set up rubric-based grading, and it's very easy to do as an instructor, just boom, 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 and it does all the calculations for you, which I appreciate. Other questions? All right, again, thanks for your attention. Is very casual and interactive, and I hope you'll interrupt me at any time. My students choose to do that, and I encourage and empower you to do the same. All right, so I teach a microbiology course. I am a classically trained scientist who came to WSU a while back. Again, we won't talk about years really, but and I'm a classically trained scientist who was never trained in education, and therefore. All right. Again, thank you for the invitation, WSU Global, and that nice introduction as well. So in a workshop situation, a panel like this, I like to know who I'm speaking to. So let me ask you some questions, and if you could raise your hand while you're eating a submarine sandwich, that'd be great. So how many of you are in the early first couple of years of your teaching career? Okay, a couple of those, great. How many of you have never taught a college level class before? None of those, all right? How many of you have taught for, let's not put numbers on, many years? Okay, all right, a number of you have taught. And how many of you are interested and receptive into learning something new about teaching? Okay, thank you, all right. So we'll move on. Here's where we're going in my segment today. I want to give you a little background about the course I teach and sort of set up the problem. I want to discuss some really good accessible approaches to solving my problem. We're going to actually practice and have some discussion that may be a little challenging to capture for those people we're streaming to. I'll summarize and leave some time for your questions, okay? So this is where I asked to teach a class in my first week of employment at WSU. So I was uniquely unprepared for that task, but I did model my teaching on some people who I thought had done it well, but I was in the wilderness. Now again, if you're in the College of Education, maybe you're actively trained in that manner. I was not that person. So I was trained in test tubes. This particular class is a pre-nursing prerequisite. That's the